and I'm delighted to welcome you today to what's going to be a really stimulating dialogue about Mexican politics. Before we begin, I want to thank the people who have made this event possible, particularly Rebecca Hasso Aguilar, who helped set it in motion, and Kira Phillip, Francis Rico, and Vicki Nelson, and the rest of the staff at the Latin American Iberian Institute who made it a reality. To have Lorenzo Meyer and John Ackerman, two of Mexico's most respected and best-known intellectuals, come to Albuquerque to share their insights with us is a truly exciting experience, not just for us, but for the broader audience who's going to have access to this website or the webcast. We'll archive it, and you'll be able to access it at laii.unm.edu. We'll have a small reception at the end of their presentations, and so I hope you'll all be able to stay and visit with our speakers. This is a tremendously important time for Mexico. It's just finished a contentious presidential election that sparked considerable scholarly and popular debate over its implications for Mexican democracy. Lorenzo Meyer and John Ackerman are at the forefront of these dialogues. These award-winning scholars are both professors at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, the country's leading university, and they're truly public intellectuals in the sense that they share their knowledge and insights beyond academia to a broader popular audience through their newspaper columns, their television appearances, their blogs, and other kinds of media. So I'm really honored to introduce them to you. I'm going to introduce both of them in sequence, and then I'm going to turn the podium over to them for their presentations, and then we'll come back for questions after the presentations, and dialogues after that are over. Lorenzo Meyer is widely considered to be Mexico's leading historian and political analyst. Dr. Meyer earned his BA and his PhD in international relations at El Colegio de Mexico, and he did postdoctoral studies at the University of Chicago. For much of his professional life, he served on the faculty of El Colegio de Mexico, where he is now a professor emeritus. And he's currently a professor in the history department at UNAM. He's been a visiting professor at leading U.S. universities, including Stanford, Columbia, and the University of Chicago. Dr. Meyer's award-winning scholarship spans the spectrum of Mexican history, politics, culture, and international relations. He's written 10 books, co-authored 6 more. He's published over 120 articles and book chapters. He's received many honors for his scholarship, including the Prize for Scientific Investigation from the Mexican Academy of Sciences, of which he's a member, and the National Prize of Sciences and the Arts. Dr. Meyer writes regular editorial columns for Mexico's national newspaper, Reforma. He also appears on a weekly television program to dialogue with other leading scholars in a political analysis roundtable. His journalistic work has earned him important accolades such as Mexico's National Press Award. Dr. Meyer is here to share with us his insights in what he calls Mexico's democratic authoritarianism. I think there's a play on words here. I can't wait to hear it. Joining him today is his colleague, John Ackerman, a leading scholar of Mexican politics and the Mexican legal system. Dr. Ackerman earned his MA and PhD in political sociology from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and then he joined the faculty of UNAM's Institute for Legal Research. His willingness to share his experience in election law, corruption control, transparency, and citizen participation has made him the go-to person when it comes to understanding Mexico's elections. His research has been funded by the Fulbright Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and the University of California Institute on Mexico and United States, US-Mexis. He's published the resulting work in a host of prestigious journals and professional outlets. He's the editor-in-chief of the Mexican Law Review. He's a prize-winning columnist for the newspapers Proceso and La Jornada, and his op-ed pieces appear regularly in leading U.S. media outlets such as the New York Times. He shares his expertise in other ways as well. He's been a consultant to the World Bank, USAID, and various other organizations. He's advised Mexico's Supreme Court and its Chamber of Deputies, and he's the vice president of Mexico's International Association of Administrative Law. Among his many honors and awards, UNAM recognized him last year as its leading young social science scholar. Dr. Ackerman is currently a visiting scholar at American University. He's here today to talk with us about his talk entitled Consolidating Authoritarianism, Learning from Mexico's Failed Transition. Please join me in welcoming Drs. Lorenzo Meyer and John Ackerman.
Well, thank you for coming. I came to this university, I think that 40 years ago, and I don't recall what it was all about. I stayed here for just one day. I remember the mountains, the Sandia Mountains, very well, but that's it. So, after 40 years, be back. Thank you for the invitation, and I want to share with you some ideas about the nature of the Mexican political system right now. I think that we just don't know where we are heading on. We know that the political situation of Mexico is a little bit messy and difficult to understand. I am willing to toy with the idea of a concept that in itself is full of contradictions. I think that Mexico is living now under an democratic authoritarianism. Well, are we democratic or are we authoritarian? Well, I think that we are both things at the same time. We are mixing both things, and we don't know which one of these two sides of the equation is going to prevail in the near future. We cannot go back to the old authoritarian political system, but I'm pretty sure that we are not heading towards the democratic future that once we thought it was possible. Now, let me start with these ideas, and then John and I agreed to share some of the ideas and to disagree in some of these points. And then have the questions, and I don't know if we will have the answers, but the questions will be welcome. The starting point is that Mexico was the most successful authoritarian political system in the 20th century, in the whole world. At the beginning, we didn't boast for this honor, doubtful honor of being the most stable authoritarian political system. But now that I see, going back, my God, we were very good at it. This political system came out of our colonial experience, an experience based on a tiny, small, minute European minority and a huge native population that for 300 years never dared to think about revolt. It was a very, very stable and successful political system, the colonial one. Then came Napoleon, the French Revolution, and many things, and Mexico tried to be a nation, and a new, modern nation state. It was the most difficult thing to build that, almost impossible. At the end of the 19th century, we finally came out with an authoritarian system headed by one powerful general, Porfirio Díaz, that was a dicta blanda. It was not a dictadura, it was a dicta blanda. He was very willing to negotiate, to co-opt, and be willing to accommodate the several political actors, and created a good, nice oligarchic system that had one problem. the problem of succession. The powers was so concentrated in the hands of Porfirio Diaz that it was impossible to institutionalize that. Then the Mexican Revolution of 1910, from 1910 to 1916, 17, took place, and after a while, a new political system that was also authoritarian, but with a democratic framework, created the all-powerful political party, PRI, that was born as Partido Nacional Revolucionario, then changed to Partido de la Revolución Mexicana, and finally to PRI that is in power today. So this machine was successful because of the Mexican Revolution, because the revolution allowed them to do something that the rest of Latin America was unable to do, to bring the lower classes, the middle classes, and the upper classes, all of them into one single shell institution, the PRI, and solve the problem of succession. Every 6 years, at the beginning 4 years, then every 6 years, quite waste time if you know beforehand who is going to be elected. So not 4, 6 years, like a clockwork, the change in the presidency and the change in many other elements of the political system. This worked very well, avoided bloody clashes among the elite. It was basically a system that was very good at co-opting, extremely good. That was their main tool. But if it was necessary, they used force, and without any problem with constraints. The powerful presidency, especially after the 1930s, the president was, of course, the head of the executive power, but he controlled the legislative perfectly, and he controlled all the states. And if it was necessary, but not in many occasions, he was able to go down to the municipal government. Everything was under a strict, politically speaking, control of the president. This system was able to go from the left to the right to the center. In the 1930s, when President Lázaro Cárdenas was the head of the state, he was really, it's the only moment in which the left came to power in Mexico. It was not through elections. It was really a kind of internal coup d'etat that General Cárdenas was able to produce, and it was the moment of the agrarian redistribution. It was the glorious moment of the labor unions. It was the moment of the nationalization of the oil industry, affecting the US and British and Dutch interests, and the moment in which the Mexican nationalists really came into the front. But because of the nature of the system, it was quite easy to go from left to center to right. The Second World War was the key moment to go from left to the center. And after the war, the Cold War, that's something that I'm working right now, the Cold War affected Mexico deeply because it gave the system the reason to be. The US was, it was before, it was then, it is today, the dominant political force in Latin America, especially in the North American, Caribbean, Central America, Mexico. Well, it gave the US the possibility to call the Mexican political system a democracy when it was not, and they knew quite well what was the nature of the system, but who cares? It gave Mexico stability, and stability was the main objective of the US in Mexico. To have a stable neighbor in the south was paramount during the Cold War. It was an extremely efficient anti-communist system that never boasts to be anti-communist. Try to be a low-profile anti-communism that worked perfectly. And the Cold War was the way to allow Mexico to be viewed as a democracy without being a democracy, because it had the imprint of the US as a democratic neighbor in the south, a democratic neighbor in the north. Everything was quite well. If we can say that this new system began in 1916, 1917, and the PRI was dislodged from power in the year 2000, then we have 83 years in a row without any problem changing the elite, but the system remained the same. That's why I say that the stability of the system was wonderful. Just look at Europe, except Great Britain. Let's see France, Italy, Spain, all of them changed. Germany, Eastern Europe. Mexico was stable, was really a model in Latin America. That's the way to handle modernization and to handle stability. Then, when the Cold War came to an end, and the third or fourth wave of democracy was in the shores of Mexico, the third wave is, according to Professor Huntington, I don't know if it's the third, the fourth wave, Mexico, suddenly the system looked like a very old one. Should be at the Smithsonian Institution, not a living political system. It was really old, awkward. So the external environment changed and the internal also. Urbanization, education, many things began to move, and communications in Mexico, and in the urban setting, the middle classes began to demand a political role. And in the year 2000, Partido Acción Nacional, a conservative, rightist party, came to power, and PRI decided that they were not going to stop this kind of political modernization. The US was more than willing to allow it, because it was a change in parties without changing anything fundamental in Mexico. It was a change in the presidency, but not in the institutions. So the year 2000 I was for one saying, well, my God, probably I will live really. I was born when the PRI was already in power, but I'm going to die when Mexico is becoming, at least in the political aspect, a democracy. I was wrong. Completely wrong. PRI is again in power. PRI is again in power without changing its nature. It's the same PRI that has not gone through a modernization. Probably it has the young face of Enrique Peña Nieto, that is now the president. He's young, good looking. The wife also, good looking. But behind them, it's the good old party created in 1929. And in 1929, it was created just by accident, because the assassination of the strong man at that moment, General Álvaro Obregón. But in fact, it was born in 1916-17, at the end of the Civil War of Mexico. The same group of people, the same outlook, the same ideology to the present. So here we are with the PRI again. It's like looking at Russia and saying, my God, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union is again there. Well, somebody can say, well, Putin is more or less like like the old USSR. But in the Mexican case, it's exactly the same party now. How you explain that after thinking that we were entering a democratic road and development, we are again back? And so there was a change in parties. There was an opening up of the press, the freedom of speech at certain level, kind of furious moment of emotion that you can have independent organizations, something that was not in the past, because that's the key element of authoritarianism, to limit pluralism. Then in the year 2000, 2001, 2002, and 2003, you could see flourishing many elements in the political landscape, in the social landscape. And why we are back into the old political system? That's the other side of the coin. My concept of authoritarian democracy. Because now, yes, we have some elements of the normal life of a democracy. Relative freedom of the press, we can say whatever we want, we can even try to organize independent social political movements, but there was a key element between 2000 and 2012. The left could not be in the presidency. That was an element that, that was present, not openly, but in fact you could feel in 2006 and 2012 that the ruling elite in Mexico, not only the political elite, but the church elite, the business elite, the intellectual elite, they allowed more plural movements in the political realm, in the social field, except that the left could be entrusted with the presidency. Then they resorted to fraud, to many tricks, and basically to the control of the television. The TV control is the key to understand what is happening in Mexico, because you can have many new ways of doing politics in Mexico, except on TV. The TV, the Mexican, there are two networks, but basically one, Televisa, that was born in the 1950s, that was born as a business between the Presidente Alemán in those years and a group of businessmen. They control TV, and the TV was extremely effective in creating a cultural milieu for the lower and even the middle classes to encourage passivity, to accept things as they are, not to bother with politics, allow politics to be the field of specialists, not a very for the average Mexican. That's a nonsense. That's it's useless. Don't bother with politics. Bother with your life and telenovelas and romance and things like that. Don't mix with politics. The TV networks, the news, especially the afternoon news, were strictly controlled, and they still are used by the right, the PRI, basically, but the PAN also, to use the kind of atmosphere created by the Cold War against the left, against communism, this time against Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and something that who was going to replace the Soviet Union. Moscow, the gold of Moscow was always there, financing the leftists and trying to overthrow the government. Well, Chavez of Venezuela. Chavez, well, at this moment, that sounds stupid. But if you have the TV, the control of TV, you can sell the idea that in the year 2006, the possibility of the left, under the leadership of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, coming into power was close to the end of the world. The TV was very good at that. López Obrador, it's a danger for Mexico, for the essence of Mexico. The same kind of political discourse that was used during the Cold War. No matter that López Obrador have never met Chavez. They don't know each other, and they are coming from very different political experiences, very different backgrounds. Don't bother to explain that. You just link Chavez and López Obrador and make it sure that they feel that if that man comes into power, the whole, not the political system, the whole nation. And the clips in TV were very good, very professional. A wall was crumbling just at the possibility of López Obrador coming into power. And López Obrador, honestly, he is from the left, but it's a very moderate left. In the good old times of the 1950s, 1960s, even the left in Mexico could not have considered López Obrador a leftist, just a centrist. He is so mild, he doesn't want to change the economic system, he doesn't want to change many things. He wants just to start a slow development, that probably in 10, 15 years, somebody really from the left will be able to arrive at the Mexican presidency. But that was too much for the right in Mexico. And that's why they use all the resources, but basically the TV. And in a recent study that I recommend for those of you that are interested, to take a look at this. It's on internet, and it's called La Geografía Electoral del 2012, the Electoral Geography of 2012, and it's a project by Mexico Evalúa, the U.S. Mexican Studies Center in San Diego, and the Program on Poverty and Governance of Stanford University. And they found, looking at the social statistics of INEGI and the electoral statistics at the level of the 66,000, I don't know how to translate this, well, local electoral districts. Looking at the statistics, they found something really funny. The poor people voted basically for the right, just like a Tea Party, something like that. They voted for Josefina Vázquez Mota, the candidate of PAN, because of the social programs, because of the oportunidades and the Seguro Popular. Those two things were very important for the lower segments of Mexican society. Secondly, for Peña Nieto, and the poor voted, very few of them, for López Obrador. López Obrador got the support of the middle class, especially urban middle class, basically union workers, government workers, the bureaucracy. So it doesn't make sense, because the political discourse of López Obrador was always in favor of the poor. He said, primero los pobres in 2006. First, the poor. In 2012, he was mild and he didn't say that. He talked about love and very peculiar things. He began to, we are all brothers. If that was the left, the radical left. And he did not receive the support of the lower classes in Mexico. And we have to take into consideration that a little bit less than half of Mexican population is classified as living under the poverty line. So we have a lot of poor in Mexico. And they were not the ones that voted for López Obrador because the TV introduced into their view of the world, again, the idea that López Obrador was a danger. Now, my half an hour is almost gone. Now, Peña Nieto, with 38% of the vote, that was López Obrador accused Peña Nieto of buying the poor. Yes, because the PRI at the local level, at the state level, never left. The majority of the local states remain in the hands of the PRI, and the PAN never tried to change that. We don't have a new constitution. We don't have a different legal institutional framework. We were using the same institutions that were very useful for the authoritarian past. They remain unchanged with a few introductions here and there. An electoral authority that was, at the beginning, we suppose that they were really above the political fray and were neutral. Not at all. That was one of the few real novelties in the Mexican political system. Now that political authority is under the control of the PRI and the PAN, basically. So with the old institutions intact and PRI coming back, the possibilities of a new kind of authoritarianism for the 21st century are there. It's not going to be like in the past, because now that's my hope, my hope. I'm not able to predict much in this field, but I hope that Mexican society is different. If PRI is the same, and if the institutional framework is the same, the social milieu, the social environment, the cultural environment of Mexico has changed. And I think that it's going to be impossible to take the clock back. But it's going to be difficult to think that this is going to be a democratic political system. It's going to be a mix. I don't know how stable or unstable it's going to be. We have to prepare for a kind of instability in the political daily life of Mexico, because PRI has now to confront social mobilizations, has to confront the new way in which people interact, the internet, that is a parallel system to the TV networks. It can give you information like this, contradicting the official information, in quotation marks, coming from the government and the TV networks. It's going to be very difficult. The fields of confrontation right now are basically two. Oil, because they want to change the nature of the oil industry in Mexico from a public industry, a public monopoly, opening it up in the way of market economics, what the market economics demand, and the new tax law. They want to introduce the easiest of the taxes, the IVA, how do you say, value-added tax. That is very democratic because everybody has to pay that. But in a very unequal situation, in which there is a huge concentration of resources in a few hands, we have the richest family in the world. How on earth we have that kind of concentration of wealth in the hands of a Slim beats me. Well, it's not too difficult to explain. With a little help from his friend Salinas, Slim was able to create this huge amount. $70 billion is more or less what the Slim and his family assets are now. Well, these two fields, oil and taxes, are going to be at the center of the new confrontation. And I will stop here. I'm unable to predict what's going to be the outcome, but it's going to be one that, of course, it's going to be interesting. But who is going to win? The authoritarian side of the Mexican politics or this newborn capacity of Mexico to behave as a democratic society, at least some parts of Mexico. And I stop here and give the microphone to John Ackerman.
Thank you very much. Hard act to follow with Lorenzo. It's an honor for me to be here with him and, of course, with Susan Tiano. Thank you very much. Rebecca Jasso, an honor, a pleasure, all of you here on the internet. Great to be here. I'll try to keep my comments short, although, you know, you guys tell me. I got the clock in front of me, but you stop me if I go overboard. I'm going to start. There's a recent paper which just right hot off the presses by someone who I almost never agree with. But he asked a very important question. It's Luis Rubio. He asked the following question. What happens to a society, and I actually do agree with some of what he says here, but we'll see. What happens to a society when corruption becomes endemic, when lawlessness becomes the rule rather than the exception, and when key functions, from government to the economy, are run by informal, illegal, or criminally violent players? What happens when institutions start to break down? My answer is Enrique Peña Nieto. Not because I have any kind of personal issue with Peña Nieto, but just because what he symbolizes and what the election of 2012 symbolizes is precisely this systematic breakdown of institutional effectiveness in Mexican society. Enrique Peña Nieto does not represent the new PRI. He literally represents the old PRI. The new PRI is a thing of the past. The new PRI was the PRI of the technocrats. Salinas, Cedillo, educated in United States universities, supposedly clean with a national vision. They ended up being just as corrupt as the dinosaurs, but at least they projected a different image and had a different idea. The dinosaurs were the local feudal lords, the state-level governors, the clientelistic politicians. Enrique Peña Nieto is a dinosaur. He was governor of the state of Mexico, which is one of the 9 states which have not undergone democratic transition. There are 9 states in which the PRI has ruled for the last 80 years, more. Well, it was before the PRI, PNR, whatever. There is not accountability. There's not an effective division of powers. There's lots of, institutions on the books, but those states, the state of Mexico and Hidalgo, and the cabinet of Peña Nieto, there are 4 ex-governors, including Peña Nieto, of Hidalgo and the state of Mexico. Peña Nieto, Choifet, Hidalgo is Murillo Karam, Osorio Chong, por supuesto. Quintana Roo. What a surprise. One another of the states that hasn't gone under a democratic transition. Secretary of Energy, Caldwell. Coahuila, Enrique Martinez y Martinez, Secretary of Agriculture. This is the reconquest of power by the dinosaurs, by state-level feudal politics. With a new image, with a new appeal. But it is quite literally, politically speaking, the retaking of the federal institutions by this group in power. This is what explains why absolutely nobody, in society at least, celebrated the return of the PRI. The day of the elections, in which the IFE, the Federal Electoral Institute, came out and announced that Peña Nieto was ahead, no one went out to the Ángel de la Independencia. No, there was absolutely no spontaneous show of excitement by society. But wait, the next day, around 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, there was a spontaneous outcry, mobilization of citizens. They went running to their local Walmarts to cash in on their cards that had been given to them over the weekend because a rumor had spread that now that elections were over, the money that had been given to them on their cards was no longer going to be valid unless they cashed it in that day. The pictures were incredible. It was like a war scene. Anaqueles, right, the shelves emptied, specifically in, and most importantly, in the state of Mexico, which is also the largest state in the country. The funding for Peña Nieto's campaign, I think it's just naive to imagine that in a context of institutional breakdown, summarized by Luis Robio, who's not a leftist radical, right? By no means, but recognized in this recent piece, as what all of us recognize, that Mexican institutions are very weak and have been even further destroyed by this narco war and the situation we have in Mexico. It's just naive to imagine that in the space of most intense political confrontation in which most power and money is at stake, that some of the most powerful actors in Mexico society, the narcos, suddenly decided to stand back and let the politicians play their game. The Federal Electoral Institute has just decided to not investigate. Well, they did a little bit of investigation. But there are very clear indications that the way in which Peña Nieto's campaign was financed was by the typical strategy of money laundering. One financial institution embedded in another financial institution, embedded in another financial institution. Why would you do that? Only if you want to hide where the money came from. We'll never know the truth. I can't say that somehow lots of narco money came into this election. But it seems to me the best presumption, the best hypothesis to follow. Hopefully the truth will come out soon. Now, the problems in Mexico are clear. We have incredible inequality, Gini coefficient 0.51, the worst in the OECD, one of the worst in the world. We have an incredible lack of growth. There has been a rebound the last couple of years of 5%, 4% growth in 2010, 2011, and 12. We've come back from this incredible dip from the 2009 crisis in which over a 4-quarter period, Mexican economy lost 9.4%. It's actually quite remarkable that we still have, some semblance of political stability in that situation. This is sort of the magic of the Mexican institutional state. We've rebounded, but we're not by no means taking off or growing in a clear way as a country. The corruption scores are as bad as ever. They've gone down over the last 10, 12 years, the Transparency International scores from 3.7 to 3.02. Violence, insecurity has gone up 60,000, 80,000, 100,000? We don't know. In addition to the disappeared, a few days before Calderon handed in his administration, December 1st, all of a sudden the Washington Post got its hand on secret documents which showed that 25,000 people had gone unaccounted for during the Calderon administration. 25,000 disappeared people in Mexico in which they just have absolutely no idea what happened. Many of those Central American migrants, many of those Mexicans, we just don't know. Some of them ended up in these mass graves, which keep on popping up. It's a complicated situation because it's not the same as in the dirty wars of the 70s. You can't point your finger at the School of the Americas, or you can't point your finger at the gringos, or at the, a particular authoritarian leader, like Ibiles, etc. But the phenomenon is the same. We're in the middle of a humanitarian crisis in Mexico. And the violence has not gone down since the arrival of Peña Nieto. People hoped that perhaps the PRI's capacity to negotiate with the narcos would lead to more peace and security, but doesn't seem like, at least for the first couple months, this has happened. But we're told, don't worry, everything's going fine. Mexico's a democracy. We have a modernizing society. So for instance, we're told that Mexico is now a middle-class society, that more people are using cell phones, buying cars, going to private schools, buying things at Walmart, right? And that this should give us optimism about the way in which Mexican society is modernizing. We're becoming sort of more individualistic, consumeristic, more Americanized. Now with the arrival of the PRI, we have the big tent politics, which is going to deal with confrontation in a better way. We have division of powers, the Supreme Court, the legislature. New autonomous agencies are going to be created. New political parties. This sounds like, even though there are problems, things are going to work themselves out. And I think Lorenzo already said this, but I want to reiterate the point that I don't think that things are going to happen by their own in any way, shape, or form. The tendencies today that we can see are bringing us in a negative direction, not in a positive one. And it's interesting because actually the literature on democratic transitions started to move in this direction and can't help us, but in kind of a contorted way. The transition as a transitólogos, how would you say that in English? The students of democratic transition are in sort of a crisis moment because those very same scholars in orientation, which has always defended a minimalist definition of democracy, are now all of a sudden switching sides. Right? So beforehand, it was those sort of more traditional establishment voices who would say, it's enough just to have elections. You radical leftists are talking about, participatory democracy and economic equality. That's not democracy. We just need to look at elections. Let's be minimalist about this. But now, all of a sudden, they're realizing that it's the other way around. So let's read something by, I think this is the Heritage Foundation. Where are we? Yes, Heritage Foundation. Venezuelan elections. From a distance, this is right before the re-election, the most recent re-election of Chavez. From a distance, the campaign for the presidency looks like many others, including those in the US. Catchy spots, large rallies, photos of Chavez kissing babies, celebrity support, including US actor Sean Penn, and negative campaign ads. Yet behind the daily flow of campaign activity is a well-coordinated Chavez strategy to retain power while appearing to preserve a semblance of electoral legitimacy. But in the Mexican case, we're not told this. There's no concerted action to control and to maintain power. It's democratic elections in which Peña Nieto wins. And the problem here is of definitions, because I don't want to get too cite too much, but there's an interesting article recently in Journal of Democracy, which is an important platform for a particular way of studying democracy, in which Stephen Levitsky's Lucan Way, these are the scholars who write this, have an article which is called Why Democracy Needs a Level Playing Field. And they say, they're saying, so we need to get rid of this sort of minimalist division because That forces us to say that places like Venezuela are democracy. We don't want to say Venezuela is a democracy. So let's incorporate more substantial versions of democracy. So what they say is that we need an even playing field. And we define, these scholars, an uneven playing field, an uneven one, as one in which incumbent abuse of the state generates such disparities in access to resources, media, or state institutions that opposition parties' ability to organize and compete for national office is seriously impaired. Hey, that sounds like Mexico, except they're not willing to talk about Mexico, because what they're saying is that this has to be limited only when incumbents abuse state power. And what happens when emerging leaders abuse private power? No, that is a democracy. There's only a problem with the electoral sphere when it's the state that's doing it. This is Cold War mentality. Dressed in a different language, but this is, 20 years after the end of the Cold War, we're still talking about bad state, good market, democratic market. It might happen at some points, but it's just it's fascinating to me that this kind of position can take. What we need to do, I think it's a good step that they're actually opening up the debate, but we need to take this seriously. And the Mexican case in particular is fascinating because so many people assume that just because we've privatized half the government, the state services, and we have multi-party elections, that it's automatically a democracy. And what we have here, at least in the Mexican case, is the classic mistake which Guillermo O'Donnell, rest in peace, always criticized as the teleological mistake. Okay? What is the teleological mistake? Teleology comes from Aristotle, right? This is the final cause. Somehow the assumption that institutions and countries will move forward towards a vision of modern Western democracy, and that all you need to do is remove the obstacles, right? But there's an inevitable process of democratization. And we see this very recently in the same Journal of Democracy. Andreas Schedler, for instance, who's actually a professor in Mexico, says that these competitive authoritarian regimes, these electoral authoritarian regimes that we're talking about, like Venezuela, Russia, I say Mexico, but no one touches Mexico. These regimes represent the last line in authoritarian defense in a long history of struggle that has been unfolding since the invention of modern representative institutions. The last line of authoritarian defense. He's saying that inevitably we at least have a form of democracy, and that this will be subverted by this concept of democracy, and inevitably the force of history will bring us forward in a democratic direction. The problem is that, at least in the Mexican case, that is not the tendency we're seeing today. What we see is an attack on basic principles of democracy. Lorenzo says there's more free press, sure. You can say whatever you want. I'm not so sure about that. I think Lorenzo Meyer can say whatever he wants. But I'm not sure that all of Mexican society can say whatever they want. Let me just say two things. How much time we got? Still 10 more minutes. A couple of things. First, an optimistic counterpoint, and then a few specific proposals. The optimistic counterpoint. Two sides. One based in Mexican history, and the other world historical process. Mexican history is, at least 20th century Mexican history, which Lorenzo knows more than anybody, is full of an incredible disposition on the part of the Mexican population to distrust and confront authority. This is seen as a weakness in Mexican political culture. They don't trust their leaders. The last Latin barometer studies, for instance, say that Mexico and Guatemala, interestingly enough, are at the bottom of the barrel in terms of satisfaction with democracy. 73% of Mexicans and Guatemalans think that democracy is not working. I say, great news. Given the situation as it is, imagine if they thought that democracy was working. They would be totally duped, right? I mean, that would be if things are going as they are in terms of institutional effectiveness and people think that that's actually working, then they have low expectations. These numbers show that Mexicans have high expectations. The youth, this middle class, supposedly consumeristic, individualistic, modern, turned out to be pretty rebellious, pretty disrespectful, pretty rambunctious. Those youth from the Iberoamericana, from the UNAM, from all the country, there is a generational shift. It's not like it's not true that there's a middle class, I wouldn't call it middle class, but there's an urbanization, there is a demographic shift. But surprise, that demographic shift is not pushing Mexico in a sort of conservative Americanized version, but that these kids are sons and daughters of a long heritage of rebelliousness. So the big question is whether Mexico's elites, political economic elites, will realize that it is in their interest, perhaps, to actually share power with this emerging group of people. Or whether they will continue to proceed on a basis of exclusion. So in the United States, middle class idea is a sort of a conformist one. Well, it turns out, surprising, that this group is actually not so conformist. They're demanding their place in Mexico's development in a very similar way as the Zapatistas, for instance, in the 90s were demanding their place. People claim that the Zapatistas, or the indigenous movement of Chiapas, was trying to separate from the Mexican Republic. This was never the case. Autonomy was about incorporating into the Mexican Republic in a democratic way, not subordinate, and not in a subordinate way, in an equal way. They wanted rule of law. They wanted to be respected and taken into account. So they were demanding their incorporation, and by being excluded, they went to revolt. The youth are demanding the same thing. It doesn't sound like it, right? They're shouting Peña Nieto off campus. They're, protesting his inauguration. But all of those shouts are demands. They're not requests. They're demands to be taken into account in national development. The youth students today don't feel like there's any real possibility for social mobility. They don't feel like they're going to have a real career path in the future, and they're right, because the economy is not growing and inequality is still huge. Now, I think another positive note is what mentioned Lorenzo already. There is no longer the pretext of the communist menace, right? The end of the Cold War is a fabulous moment. For two reasons. For one reason, that you can't, write people off as communists anymore. And on the other hand, the last 20 years has been a process in which neoliberalism has been exposed as a political, not an economic project. Neoliberalism was sold to us as an ideology, right? Privatization, making the government smaller, the state smaller. Application of Chicago school principles, technocracy. But what we've seen over the last 20 years is that actually neoliberalism, what it is in fact, is a political project of expropriating larger rents for particular individuals, right? So Salinas, yes, applied some economic principles, but what he really did, if we really want to define the Salinas sexenio, was handing over great, huge sections of the state and giving it to his friends, right? This is reductionist, of course, but we're on that's where Salim's wealth comes from. And then balloons under Fox and even more under Calderon. It's been the last 6 years particularly that Salim became number one. He wasn't before. And so this kind of nakedness of neoliberalism, it's no one really believes that these guys are really trying to make markets more efficient. It's so clear that it's a political ploy. And that also plays in favor of the youth movements, of the new movements. And when you look at the demographics of the vote, Lorenzo already mentioned one study. If you look at other exit polls, for instance, from Reforma, from Mitofsky, from Parametria, all of them show that urban, middle class, educated youth all voted very clearly against Peña Nieto, and in great deal in favor of López Obrador, even though supposedly López Obrador was, not the middle class candidate. Supposedly, Marcelo Ebrard was the one who was supposed to appeal to that population, but we see that actually it's not the case. López Obrador was actually very much the middle class candidate, for better or for worse, but that's what happened. So I think we're actually, even though we're in this, there are these two forces that Lorenzo well identifies. I wouldn't leave it up in the air as much and sort of to see which one's going to win. I think we're in a situation right now in which the authoritarian project has won a resounding, given a resounding defeat to the democratic project in the 2012 elections, without a doubt. Starting in 2006, but this is a moment in which the authoritarian project is triumphant, and you can see it in their faces, right? I mean, it's just out there every day. This whole idea of the Pact for Mexico is all about that, this sort of triumphal march, bringing everybody into this sort of big tent analysis. Why does it all have to be together in one big bag? Why can't we talk about each one of the policy initiatives, one by one? I agree with that, I don't agree with it. Debate them in Congress. Precisely because what Lorenzo said. This is all a big, I don't know if I want to say cover-up, but a big political strategy to get to the central points, which is the privatization of oil and fiscal reform, particularly value-added taxes. There's no other reason for bunching it all together. What they want to do is avoid a specific debate about these specific issues because they know that they can very likely lose on that. And if they lose on those, everything starts to unravel. That's why the next few months are going to be very strategic, particularly the issue of oil and fiscal reform, because that's what Peña Nieto publicly committed to achieving to his sponsors and supporters. And if he can't do that soon, he risks becoming another Vicente Fox. And that would be a total disaster for him and the PRI, because everything that they're about is avoiding becoming another Vicente Fox, right? Or Calderon as well. I mean, it's all about sort of contrast with those. So they've even presented these, incredible diagnostics of, like, for instance, Luis Rubio himself is doing it, of the last 12 years, how things are so bad now, so that they can show that they actually bring in results. And if they can't do that soon, this very active civil society with this long tradition of rebelliousness and protest is going to have an opportunity to come out again. I have no question in my mind that it's going to, whether it's going to bull up again or not. The question is when and how, and what kind of specific proposals it brings out on the table. And I'll finish with that. What could be a few proposals that we could throw out there, which could be ways to galvanize or think about what a citizens' movement could put forth? One, redistribution of wealth. Before it was land reform, redistribution of land. Let's talk about redistribution of wealth. If it has become clear that neoliberalism is about inequality and it's a political project, let's attack it directly at its source. Let's impose a wealth tax. France, Spain have it. Oh, that's scary in the Mexican context, but it shouldn't be, right? Value-added tax, wealth tax. Value-added tax, everybody pays it. Wealth tax, only the most rich pay it. We got a lot of those, right? 10 families control 10% of GDP in Mexico. 2, transitional justice. Top officials should be held to account for their actions. Felipe Calderón, Genaro Garcia Luna. If they are not even investigated, that will set an enormous precedent for the next administration to do whatever it wants. Now, here the United States is not an example, right? I just finished a very interesting book about this by Glenn Greenwald. You know who he is? He's a journalist, analyst at The Guardian, who has traced recently the last 40 years of executive impunity in the United States from the Nixon pardon up through the torture memos and the Obama lack of interest in actually investigating war crimes under George Bush. So the tendency is, and that's why we have, no surprise then that Calderon's at Harvard and Zedillo's at Yale, and the United States is so complacent and in favor of the lack of transitional justice. But I think that is a very important point to put on the agenda in terms of ending impunity for the top officials. And third, let's try to think about strategies for retilting the playing field. So it's clear that the playing field is tilted. We have these very important electoral reforms, which supposedly were going to control the playing field. I mean, for instance, the prohibition against the hiring of hiring, can you say that? The contratación, the purchasing of advertising, political advertising on television and radio. That's now prohibited. Very strict limits on funding and on spending, of course, right? But this hasn't worked, so perhaps we need to think of, I don't know, more creative ways of retilting the playing field. Your guess is as good as mine of what kind of proposal we can think about. There was a enrichment initiative in the Asamblea de Representantes, the local house, the Congress of Mexico City. A proposal was sent to the Congress recently to incorporate election by lot, by sorteo, of, I think it was 30% of the deputies. I don't think that's a bad idea. Given the system we have today, we are guaranteed to have the winners be people who are not prepared for their office and who are accountable to the powers that be. If we had some sort of random selection, not absolutely random, but some sort of, you guys have read the Borges story, right? La Lotería de Babilonia, I think it's called. Right? That's sort of an exaggerated case of it. But if we had some sort of lot, we would at least have the possibility that some of the people who came into power might actually be interested in doing things for the public good, right? That would be, as we have it now, everything is kind of set up so that those who get there, even if they're sort of good guys, the way they get there, and then what they have to do while they're there, guarantees that they will be beholden to the powers that be. Now, this is also probably the US case, right? We could talk about that later, right? But at least in Mexico, it's sort of more transparent, well, more or less, I don't know, but it's transparent. We're talking about Mexico. And so maybe that's just a crazy idea, but we need to think about different ways of organizing election institutions because something is happening. And our strategy so far has not been working in Mexico. So that's just some ideas out there, some analysis, all over the place, but I think it tries to present at least a vision of what's happening today, both pessimistic and optimistic in some ways as well. Thank you very much.
Well, we thought coming here that we can engage a little bit in discussing our views and our differences, or throw some other ideas, and then to have the question and answer period, isn't it? That's the way in which we are going to proceed. Well, what about talking on a subject? You touch about it a little bit, but I honestly don't have an answer in regard to violence. Mm-hmm. Violence is such a horrible event in Mexico, a new wave of violence that has no precedence, not even in the Mexican Revolution, because now violence is with an addition, torture. They don't kill you. They first try to torture you in a way that the whole society knows that this new power, the narco traffickers, are there. They are challenging the state. They are challenging Mexican society. They are even challenging the US. And the way they kill people, it's so gruesome. It doesn't make sense. But to keep these guys alive, throw them boiling water, trying to take their skin before killing them. Then these young people of 14 years old in the state of Morelos that was a specialist in beheading people, a 14-year-old guy. Now, what's going to happen with this culture of violence? Violence, who are these guys? They are coming from where? From the lower classes. Those who don't have a chance in the market economy, of course. Not the least. This new group of Mexicans that are given weapons, money, lots of money. The last time, I think that it was 3 or 4 days ago, John, that I came to some news in the El Universal that I don't believe, but it's a news that was the whole page. How much money is lavado? The laundry business of money.
Money laundering. Yeah.
Money laundering. The figure came from the US. $3.9 billion a year. I just cannot believe that because it's more than the oil exports that we have. And the country remains poor. So where is this money going? But don't take this figure too seriously. But the fact is that there is a lot of money that is going to a certain extent to the lower elements of society, is lifting them up through violence, through extreme cruelty. And what are we going to do with these people? Let us suppose that for some reason narco traffic is ended in not only in Mexico but in Latin America. What do you do with these people? It's like in the Guatemalan society after the end of the civil war, the caiviles. What do you do with these people that were trained to be extremely cruel in suppressing rebellion in the Indian countryside? What do you do with them? If they don't have the narco traffic business, they cannot go back to society and take a job like drivers or in masons or something like that. They will go to kidnapping, to different ways of robbery. The lawlessness that is now in Mexico is still in the infant stage. What's going to happen with this part of how the Mexican political system is going to react, democratic or authoritarian? This is a challenge, a real one that I don't have an idea of what to do with them. How do you reincorporate them into normal life? It's an impossibility. In the old times, with Porfirio Diaz in charge, with the first real moment in modern history in Mexico that we have a functioning state, well, he decided to kill them. That was a solution of sorts. Now we cannot resort to that solution. So what is going to happen, regardless of what the political system, the formal political system is going, more democratic, less democratic, more authoritarian, what are we going to do with this challenge to the state and to Mexican society?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that in many ways what is happening is that Mexico is pursuing a strategy of social cleansing, of killing them off. When Calderon would go up publicly and say 90% of the dead are narcos, what he was saying is justifying this, saying that they're just killing themselves off amongst themselves. And by permitting this to happen, or at least being apologetic publicly about it, he was indirectly authorizing a strategy of, eliminating them, having them when many of these people are, most of them are young, absolutely innocent people, and even if they weren't innocent, don't deserve to die, of course. That is what's happening today. That is the strategy. So we have to stop that. And also, I think, understand this phenomenon as, I don't know how to call it, a social uprising. It's not an ideological uprising, and I don't want to confuse it with Colombia or anything. But I mentioned before, 9.4% of the GDP in 4 quarters has to be expressed somehow. And I think it is being expressed in this way, by this desperation of these kids who get caught up in this strategy. And so the solution is, jobs, right? Perhaps it sounds too simple on one hand, and on the other hand, it is attacking impunity, because you mentioned money laundering. Really interesting. When Peña Nieto announced his new strategy, he did not mention money laundering.
No.
He did not mention, he said, we're going to end the war on drugs, we're going to do more social development, institutional transformation, but he did not mention money laundering. HSBC recently was fined billions of dollars for its direct complicity with money laundering in Mexico. The United States administration, Barack Obama, Felipe Calderón, Enrique Peña Nieto, all of them have refused to press any criminal charges against anyone. It's just like what happens in elections. The fine goes to the institution, HSBC pays it off in 2 days, 3 days. The individuals responsible for the money laundering, scot-free, and the example is for this to continue to happen. Wachovia had a deal about 2 or 3 years ago, similar to this. Wachovia was actually exposed, it turned out, during the economic crisis of 2007-8. Wachovia actually sort of helped save the US economy by removing money laundering controls. It was actually the Mexican narcos through Wachovia and other banks which sort of refunded the US economy. Right? So it's very complicated. In the end, sort of the central obstacle for me is the concentration of social power in Mexico, right? Because the problem is if you start going after the money, if you start really looking into bank accounts to charge taxes on one hand, which is what has to happen, wealth taxes I was talking about, to do that you need to get in there, or to control money laundering, you're going to very quickly find that it's very difficult to see where the clean money stops and then dirty money starts. The dollar bills or peso bills are not going to have sort of blood on them. It's all kind of flowing around there. Buscaglia, for instance, says that 60-70% of the Mexican economy has some link to narco trafficking. It's a very slippery slope. So the government's choice is let's just not even go there, because that would create even more protest from the people who are really powerful. But that's where things top-level elite economic and political impunity is what would allow the government to actually, turn the corner, and then that would also free up the resources to actually have a national development strategy. But to do that, we need to have a government or a social movement which is actually independent from these powerful economic and political forces. And that's what has not been possible so far, and that's what's so frustrating about the malfunctioning democracy or authoritarian democracy, as Lorenzo says today in Mexico. No? Or what do you think?
There is a British journalist that wrote a book on Mexico that came out
Joe Tuckman, right?
last year, Grillo.
John Grillo, sí.
John Grillo. And he talks about narco-insurgency. He says there are armies right now, well organized and better armed than the Mexican army. The weapons coming from the US, I suppose that, I don't know if New Mexico is probably a provider, but Arizona, much more, and Texas, and they pay excellent prices for those assault weapons and things like that. So there is an army. There are several armies in Mexico right now that we don't know how to introduce them in a political analysis. Even as I said, if you stop the drug trafficking, the culture is already there. They have learned how many people have been killed in this war, between 60,000, 100,000. That doesn't matter because young people are millions of young people in Mexico willing to take their places. Because what is the alternative? A gray, dull life in poverty for the next 30, 40, 50 years, or a short, rich, and brutal life of 3, 4, 5 years. So we have that insert in the culture of Mexico right now. Another element that we didn't touch.
Culture? You say it's culture?
The culture. The studies in Durango and in Sinaloa. There are families that their fathers, great grandfathers came to the narco in a very humble way. Now they are. El Chapo Guzman is in Forbes list of the billionaires of the world. He was a very humble young person in Sinaloa. With I think he had elementary school, and now Forbes says he has $1 billion, probably more. This is a success story. This is something incredible. It's like Benito Juarez in other areas in Mexico. A humble shepherd coming president. Well, this humble little guy, Shorty, from a very small town in the north of Mexico, suddenly engaged in business with Asia, with Europe, and of course with the United States, and has an army of his own, and has also an army of accountants, and he's managing billions of dollars. It's a success story, but it's a negative one. How this is going to influence the image that young Mexicans have of their country, their destiny, their private lives, their individual lives. That's a possibility. If you don't have jobs, and you have the narco traffickers, and they are offering you jobs, how this is going to interject with our analysis of Mexico's political development. Also, there is another different item here, is the way in which Peña Nieto, it's not Peña Nieto, the Priistas are now handling the immediate future. They created this, what's the name, Plan Mexico?
Pact for Mexico.
Pacto, the Pact for Mexico. Using cooptation, that's the best weapon they have. They said, here you have 98 ideas of economic, political, social, judicial elements that everybody has to agree. And PRD from the left, PAN from the right, PRI in the center, all of them signed the pact. This is what we want. So the political elite is creating a space for themselves, trying to give this kind of new idea of Mexico. Everybody agrees with this. This is a very fine platform for the immediate future. And all the political parties, the political class is accepting this. This is cooptation in the great style of the PRI. But are there everybody in this game? No. Andrés Manuel López Obrador and his new party is outside. The Zapatistas are outside. The social movement, Yo Soy 132, are outside. So the political class that is detached from the rest of society, and this is nothing that we can say, but it's all sorts of opinion polls are saying, well, something similar in the US, that the average citizen hates the political class. They don't feel represented by the parties, the parliament, the presidency, or even the local governments. They have the idea of politics as something nasty, gray, corrupt. So the political class is building this kind of castle in the air. Everybody is happy, smiling, in love with each other in this sort of dream political system. In the base in Mexican society, the distance from this idea is, the gulf is very big. So the immediate political agenda of PRI and Peña Nieto and the right and the left, institutional right and institutional left, is to be together, everybody together. This is a moment in which they are trying to make kind of a salvation agreement because it's a national emergency, but they are not taking everybody in. They are selecting, trying to sell the idea that all relevant political actors in Mexico are together. And we think that this is not the case. So those outsiders are going to be able to do something. They are going to challenge this. Who is going to prevail? The political class has a blueprint there to present to themselves, to the Mexican society, and to the world that there is an agreement, a national salvation program in this Pacto for Mexico. But it is, the Zapatistas are saying no. López Obrador is saying no. And the society is detached from them. I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, these are big questions. I think I'll talk a little bit and then we'll open it up. No, the question of culture I think is interesting because I understand what you're saying, Lorenzo, in terms of there being a cultural phenomenon. Yes, of course, this has manifested itself in culture, the crisis that we're living today. But, and I know you're not saying this, but it sounds like what Alonso Lujambio said. Rest in peace. Alonso Lujambio said that the real problem with Mexico today, the cause of the violence is, a crisis in family values and moral values, right? That somehow the solution, and beyond diagnosing the problem, what he was saying is that the solution would be, cultural education, having people sort of, unified families, religious values, this kind of stuff. And even López Obrador fell into that kind of logic a little bit with a sort of loving campaign, right? And I think that I personally, maybe it's just a phobia I have, I don't like talking about it as a cultural problem in that way, because it makes it sound as if it's sort of unsolvable, unchangeable, when it as a way of acting. I think, yes, there's a cultural manifestation, but the actions we need to take shouldn't be in the cultural realm, but should be on the other realm. Right? I think you agree with me. It's just that's I just want to explain why alarms start going off in my head when we start talking about culture. And in order to change this culture, to change the practice, we don't need cultural interventions. We need economic and social interventions, right? And the big crisis here is that we don't have social mobility. There is no social mobility today in Mexico. I would like to see statistics. We should look at that. Because there's a lot of numbers on inequality of wealth, income, concentration, but I haven't seen recently good statistics on social mobility. I mean, is the most recent generation actually doing better or worse than their parents? And do they think they're going to do better or worse than their parents in the future? My impression is that the real crisis here is a crisis of social mobility in the sense that youth today, the poorest, and this goes all the way, this is what links Yo Soy 132 en Ibero to the kid in Morelos who's learned how to chop off heads. It's the same kind, it's not a moral crisis, it's the crisis, they share a desperation, a lack of hope in, hard work actually leading to a career path and a happy life, right? And if we don't resolve that problem, we're not going to resolve anything else, right? And going to the Pact for Mexico, I think that, Lorenzo completely right. It's just so funny. This happens in the United States as well. I've been seeing this as I've been here for the last few months. I don't know why people think that it's democratic to agree all the time. I've always assumed the contrary. I've always assumed that democracy is about learning how to disagree, right? And having discussions and debating. And when you agree all the time, I start getting really suspicious because this is sort of the classic critique of lots of authors from Ian Shapiro recently and lots of other stuff. But when you have sort of a false consensus, it's obvious that the power differences are just being papered over. A democratic situation is one in which you can openly disagree with someone else, and that's okay. It's an autocratic situation in which disagreeing excludes you from the system. And that's what the PRI is creating, is a situation in which by disagreeing, you immediately are marginalizing yourself. And that is really dangerous, and that's a return to the past. That's an authoritarian political strategy. It's also played here in the United States. I think Obama falls into it far too often as well. We all need to agree, and that's somehow an indication of that he's really democratic. Is he taking into account? No, right? That's a different context, of course. But it's just very clear in the Mexican case how the PRI is just using the same. That's what gives me hope, also, Lorenzo. The fact that the priestess are so transparently just repeating the same, with the same people, the cabinet, I was really hoping or expecting, I don't know if I was hoping, but expecting that the Peña Nieto cabinet would have more surprises. There was, Rosario Robles, Mario de Constanzo, there's some, but I was thinking that these guys would realize that they are in a very weak position after winning 38% of the vote and having most of sort of the more dynamic sectors of society against them. I always think that they would realize that and actually do something serious about their cabinet and the proposals that would try to actually address that problem. But I don't see them actually addressing the problem. I see them using the same old strategies to sort of just cover up the situation. And that's what gives me hope in terms of the fact that they're not innovating their authoritarianism. It's the same old authoritarianism, and like you're saying, it is a new society. We do have a new society. The question is, how that confrontation is going to manifest itself, and that's the, hopefully as peacefully and productively as possible. And that will depend not so much, I think, on the ideology or the strategy of the youth or of López Obrador, but more on the strategy and ideology of the elites, whether they finally realize that they need to share power. I think, based on past experience, we can't expect good things from Mascárraga and Slim, but
Shall we open for discussion?
Sure, and if you guys would, those of you who have questions, please come up to the microphone and ask it there,
Sí,
and that
sí,
way
sí,
we'll be
sí.
able to pick up your question. Yeah.
Vicente Fox, I think in a year or so ago, recommended that Mexico legalize drugs, and that this was a major solution to Mexico's problem.
One by one, or
One.
why don't we get a bunch of questions? No, or not?
Well, it's the same.
Just don't forget.
Legalization of drugs. Okay, that's
Good afternoon, and thank you for your wonderful exposition. I'm Rodrigo Vaz from this University School of Law. And my question is, well, I think that you cannot explain the political Mexican system without talking about the education system, right? Mm-hmm. And how it is kidnapped by this powerful lady, the Professor Elba Ester, the leader of the union. But now the Peña Nieto administration has appointed as a minister this guy, Choy Fett, who is an old dinosaur, but is also a good enemy of the Maestra Elba Ester. So my question is, how do you see the future of the education in Mexico and its impact on politics, and how you said? Thank you.
Hay que empezar. Sí, son dos preguntas grandes.
Okay, this microphone is not for Mexicans, is it? Okay. My name is Nidia Martinez. I'm from the history department at this university. And one of the terms that you use a lot in your presentation is the idea of democracy. And I would like for you guys to explain a little more in how you envision democracy in the context of Mexico, in contrast to what we understand as democracy in this country.
That's a good. My God, with these three questions, we can use 2 hours. But now, because we were told that at 6 o'clock there is a break for the good to socialize. Well, the legalization of drugs, that's an interesting question that is coming time and again in Mexico, but we know quite clearly that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the drug question was not internal to Mexico. There were very few drug addicts in regard to the whole population. Now it's different. Now it's taking hold of many young people that are coming into this kind of life that in the past we thought drugs are for export. It's our export, one of our export items. Now it's for internal consumption. Now, if this legalization that is discussed openly in Mexico in many circles, we cannot do that without the United States because that is a big market. I have been doing some research on U.S.-Mexican relations since the 1940 to the present for my work on Cold War. Mexico wanted, it's a wonderful and very sad experience. I will be very synthetic in this. In the 1939, during the last days of President Cárdenas' presidency, a medical doctor that was in the Departamento de Salubridad, there was no ministry, it was a small thing, the Departamento de Salubridad decided that drug addicts were not delinquents, they were just sick people. Let us start a program, 1939, in which the government was going to give marijuana, opium, cocaine was not there. It's opium and marijuana. Provided a weekly doses to those who accept that they were addicts, and try to put them in a program of disintoxication. But it was going to be the government who was going to provide them with the drugs. Freely, gratis. And that's going to take the power of the narco-traffickers, the small band of narco-traffickers that were there in Mexico. Immediately, the State Department asked the U.S. Embassy in Mexico to tell the Mexican government that if they dare to do that,
there were going to be consequences. Mexico was going to be denounced at the League of Nations in that moment, that it was violating the international agreements, and they could cut Mexico from importing medicines from the US and other countries. So the idea of having a Mexican policy in regard to the drug addiction was killed before being born. This doctor, that one of my students is doing a dissertation on that, was sacked from the government and forget about doing anything in regard to legalization of drugs without the consent of the US. And that was Cárdenas at the peak of Mexican nationalism. So for us, the US is the key actor here. We can talk about legalization, and Mujica, the president of Uruguay, that I love the guy. He is really my hero in among presidents in Latin America. He gives 80% of his salary to local charities. He doesn't live in the presidential palace. He lives in his 2-bedroom house, and he doesn't have a presidential guard, and he drives his Volkswagen. Well, he proposes in Uruguay, well, he was against it, but the parliaments proposed the legalization, and he said, well, if the parliament wants, it's okay. So there are, in other countries in the south of the continent, willing to do that. But Mexico, with a border with the US, it's impossible for us to legalize that. And even Fox, he said one thing and immediately went back to the previous position after the US said no. When it was the last in the last term, the last stages of his presidency, that he toyed with the idea of legalization and then decided not to go ahead. But we are discussing that, yes. But without the US, it's really an impossible policy. Now, the education and what democracy means in Mexico.
So to answer a different question or the same one?
Yeah, well, it's a democracy here.
I'll do a small comment on the legalization thing, and then I'll take on democracy and leave education to you. Is that okay?
Okay.
You're the friend of El Bestes.
Yeah.
The legalization. Well, first of all, what does the law say today? We're actually in a situation that's a little different from what people imagine. In Mexico, it actually is legal to possess and consume drugs, marijuana, heroin, cocaine. In fact, a couple years ago, the Supreme Court decided that if you're an addict, in this sort of tradition, going back to the if you're an addict, you can even violate the law. You can possess 2 or even 3 times as much as what the law prohibits if you are medically diagnosed as an addict. So there is kind of a basic tolerance within Mexican legal framework for at least the consumption and possession of drugs. Selling and transit is what is illegal, and on the other side of the border, of course, in the United States, Colorado, Washington. I mean, we're actually making some pretty serious progress towards legalization in the United States. Calderon himself, of course, it's always easy to do when you're on your way out. Right? Fox didn't do it when he was in. Zedillo didn't do it when he was in. Now, when they're out, they start talking about legalization. Calderon also, in his last speech to the UN, as well as Santos, actually, in Colombia, both were very clear about their positions that the UN should create a special commission to investigate the possibility of legalizing or market. Right. But I think, and the arguments against this are, to me, non-arguments. The most important argument, which Calderon and Poiré, his Secretary of Gobernación, kept on rolling out, was the idea that somehow, because the narcos have diversified their portfolio of crime, contraband, human trafficking, that legalizing drugs was not going to be the response because this would just, it would force them to be even more criminal in these other areas, right? And so that by squeezing them on this side, all you're going to do is force them to be even more violent. Which to me is just such an argument based on complete defeat, right? I mean, so then we can't do anything, right? I mean, if a strategy which would, and everybody accept this, remove 20% of their income from the narcos is not good because this would just force them to be even more criminal, then no wonder nobody's doing anything about the narcos because any attack on them, they're just afraid that it's going to be counterproductive. And the problem is that it actually is because the institutions aren't working, right? But this is not an argument against legalization. This is just, this argument against legalization demonstrates the underlying problem. I haven't heard any anti-legalization argument beyond the sort of moral, ethical ones, which even make sense. And those make sense, although I don't agree with them, of course. Democracy in Mexico and the United States. It's been really interesting for me. I live and work in Mexico, and that is my home, but I've been in the United States since September. My sort of re-encounter with the United States political system has demonstrated to me how similar the two systems are, surprisingly. I never idealized the US democracy at all, but now I do so less than ever. It's just, the increasing inequality, the incredible amount of money in politics, the impunity of top officials are bringing us together, Mexico and the United States and other countries. And this can hopefully lead to rethinking, international solidarity, right? I think that there's many things that the United States can learn from Mexico in the questions of democratic and electoral practice, and there are many things that we need to get together to see these sort of larger problems which unify both Mexico and the United States. We just need to rethink the way in which, from the United States, we think about solidarity to Mexico. I think Mexicans can show lots of solidarity to the United States. We've gone through lots of these very same problems and haven't solved them, but at least have tried and learned some lessons that perhaps the United States have don't have as clear as us. This history of over 100 years of sham elections in Mexico, right? In Mexico, we are. This is it's not a new thing that elections don't lead to 200 years, right? Mexicans have a long experience with elections which are not actually about social power and debate, but about just sort of changes between elites, and so it's not this huge disappointment for us that elections don't actually have democratic content, and this means that maybe we have something to teach to the United States and other countries about how, even though, a pesar de, right, in spite of the fact that the elections are often shams, we can still struggle for democratic process outside of the system. And I think there are different ways in which engagement between the two sides can happen on that topic.
Democracy in Mexico is something, it's basically a dream, an idea. It's an ideal situation that we have never experienced. It's utopia. And every nation, every society needs a little bit of utopia. And that was the year 2000 when we thought, my God, we are approaching something like democracy. Now, it's gone, that idea. But basically, for Mexico to be a real democracy, it has to tackle the problem of social inequality, because you cannot have political equality with such a huge amount of inequality. And in regard to education, well, in the year 1994, when Salinas' presidency was ending, he decided, in order to give a push to this, to introduce Mexico as member of the Organization of Economic, it's Organization for Economic, OECD. The Club of the Rich Nations. Well, we were not rich, but there is something coming out of these statistics, because now we have to compare ourselves with Finland, with Denmark, with France, with the US. As a matter of course, there is no way out. And one of these statistics are on education. And my God, only Turkey is close to Mexico in this, disaster area that is education. Education, the low quality of education in Mexico comes out of the statistics when it says how many people are able to handle Spanish and mathematics, arithmetic really. And there is only a tiny, small minority that can really handle his or her own language well in the elementary education and mathematics. The majority of Mexicans are in these two fields that are so basic for formal education, language and mathematics, just completely reprobados, how do you say that? Failed. So education is a problem in Mexico. Formal education is a problem because the teachers' union is part of the political elite of those. The teachers are very good at manipulating electoral behavior. They have excellent people in looking at elections, where to put emphasis, who that district is going to vote this way, that district is to the opposition. They are experts in that. The teachers, because they have several thousand teachers exclusively doing political research, teaching the kids, forget about it. That's not a real business. We are a power. The union is 1,002,000 members. It's the most powerful union in Mexico. So they are not interested in improving the quality of education. They are interested in keeping their share of political power. And that's a problem that even Peña Nieto now tries to confront, but we don't really know if he's going to be able to really have a confrontation with the union and introduce what they said that they wanted to introduce, that is educational reform that will improve the standards of Mexican education, because we cannot compete with in the global market with that kind of labor force that is undereducated, but that is extremely powerful. And this lady, Elba Ester, it's a jewel in political terms. She knows everything. She can teach you all the tricks, the political tricks, and she's power herself. Look at her, and you are looking at the personification of power. As a teacher, she cannot speak well. When in a couple of occasions, when she had to read something in a public speech, she failed. But reading is not her main virtue. It's how to handle political power, how to survive. This union was a key element in the old authoritarian system, became a key element in the new democratic system, and is still. She has her own political party. How come? I know that the teachers' union in the US are under attack, and for reasons that are not completely different from the Mexican case. But the teachers don't have a party of their own in Mexico. They have their own party with 1 or 2 senators and several representatives and lots of money because the government deducts from the salary of each teacher a certain amount of money that is given immediately to the teachers union, and by law nobody can go inside the treasury of the union and examine how are you using this money. By law is prohibited. It's sacred. So if you want to learn how to handle political power in a non-democratic system, the teachers in Mexico can teach you a lot. But mathematics or Spanish language, no, that's extremely difficult.
The problems I say with the it's not actually, I mean, the proposal that is on the table is a constitutional reform, right? To Article 3, which is kind of just an abstract change which incorporates the idea of quality education and evaluation of teachers, stuff like that, which in and of itself is not necessarily bad, but what looks like the real strategy of Joyfet and of Peña Nieto, who doesn't like books too much either, Peña Nieto, right, is not so much to democratize the teachers' union, but to eliminate teachers' union and to incorporate sort of more neoliberal, corporate vision of what education is all about. So testing, testing is okay, but when it's done from a logic of productivism and of testing the capacities which are demanded by, for instance, corporations and businesses for their employees, instead of thinking of a more humanistic kind of education and quality education, that's where the problem is going to be. Because by couching it in terms of quality education and bad el vestir, which is how Peña Nieto is doing it, it leaves us without a choice. It's kind of like with the electrical workers union or with the privatization of telecoms, right? Bad state, let's privatize, and that will solve our problems. But we've already seen that that is not the case. All we do is create private monopolies which control things in the same way as the public monopolies. So if the result of this reform turns to basically putting more business-oriented education as the norm in Mexico, this would not necessarily be major progress. What we need to find, we need to democratize the teachers. I think having teachers union is a good idea. Unions in general are pretty important in a capitalist economy. The problem is that our corporatist, top-down, corrupt unions do exactly the opposite of what a union is supposed to do. Instead of defending the workers and making sure that service provision is in the interest of the teachers' values and the students, what it ends up doing is just increasing the power of the leaders. And so that's what I don't see any indication that Joyfet is actually interested in supporting the democratization of the teachers' union and strengthening humanistic education of the Mexican people. No, he may have a personal vendetta against El Vestir, which can only get so far. They'll have already striking a deal, it seems, because she protested in the beginning and then she's been kind of quiet. So that's how the PRI works. They yell and scream and they break a deal. And in the end, what this will imply is probably some sort of national testing and stuff, but which will be maybe be able to kick out some of the worst, laziest, not lazy, but inefficient or politicized teachers. But that's not necessarily going to lead to an empowerment of the teacher. What we need is to actually empower the teachers, right? And in relation to their leadership. I mean, the teachers should be the ones who are powerful. And so it doesn't seem to me that kind of more full strategy is even on the table, but we'll see.
Well, it's 6 o'clock, as you told us, that we should not abuse our time.
You've been very good at keeping to your time. I feel bad that we don't have time for more questions. Is anybody just dying to ask one more? I thought you might, Lois. Please come up.
My name is Lois Meyer. I'm in the College of Education. I work very closely with the indigenous teachers of Oaxaca. The only comment I would say is I think it's important to talk about resistance movements within the teachers' movement. And there are formal resistance movements and there are local resistance movements. And I would hate for this audience to leave thinking that the way you've described the teachers is the complete story of the teachers of Mexico. Thank you.
Yeah, I was trying to get at a little bit of my comments is that there is even sort of a special group of teachers in the CENTE, the CNTE instead of the SNTE, and in Oaxaca as well. Very important mobilization of exactly teachers looking for a democratic teachers movement for an empowerment of the teachers against their leadership to improve education, and that's where the change should be grounded in.
The teachers' union was extremely important in resistance in the 1950s when they had a leadership and confronted the government during the Ruiz Cortines presidency, and after that, but they had to bear the full reaction of the government, and they destroy what used to be the teachers' kind of energy to transform Mexico, because the teachers were extremely important after the revolution. They were really the ones that introduced the rural Mexico into the idea of a new nation and new possibilities, the social values of the Mexican Revolution. The teachers were really wonderful in the 1920s, the 1930s, even the 1940s. But then it became so engaged in this kind of politics that the system decided to stop them and to crush them, to use the police, to use the army, and to provide the ways that new leaders, the one previous to El Baester, Longitud Barrios, for example, they were creatures of the system to annihilate the spirit of the passion of resistance and the transformation that the teachers wanted in the 1940s, even the 1950s. Then passivity became more or less the prevalent rule. And now, if there is resistance among the teachers, the union as a whole is still very much part of the establishment. If you compare what the teachers were in the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s to the situation today, it's very sad. I agree that there are movements, resistance, that Oaxaca is particularly important in this aspect. But looking at the whole picture, they are very much under the control of El Baester, because if they want to have a change in position, to go up on the ladder, everything is under the control of the union. And if they are looked with suspicion by the bureaucracy that is the union, my God, it's going to be very tough for them to survive. So each one individually may think have many ideas about their role, but their political behavior, the majority of them, is subservient to what El Baester and the whole elite of that union is saying.
One thing is political control, and the other thing is, which is very real, but the other thing is the sort of the spirit. I wonder whether, if, El Baester and the leadership were just knocked out, what percentage of, rank and file CENTE, SNTE members could be courted to a more democratic cause. I think probably the vast majority. There still is this kind of, rural and elementary school teachers in particular do have this kind of idea of service to the community and commitment to justice and this kind of thing, and they're caught up in the system run by El Bester, but it's kind of like the whole system, as we were talking about, sort of in a larger context, right? So the PRI now has control over the levers of power, but the idea that somehow Mexican society as a whole is accepting it is we're getting the lights. El Bester is out there right now.
It's El Bester.
Is this great? Are we supposed to stop?
I think they're probably kicking us out of here, aren't they?
But,
All right,
but, actually, first, let us thank our speakers. This has been fabulous. This is a good example of the kind of event that we're going to be putting on the rest of this semester. So please do check our website and see what else is happening. And I want to make a special announcement that SOLAS, our student organization group, is having the Sin Fronteras Film Festival this weekend. So we're hoping that you'll be able to join us for that as well. And now, because we're here, and I hope they're not going to turn the lights out, we're having a reception. We have libations in the back, and now is the time for us to mingle, get to know each other if we don't yet, speak to our speakers and engage them in more personal dialogue, and I hope you'll stay with us. Thank you.